Hey everybody, I'm MS Farzan, and welcome back to this video series on how to make a 2D multiplayer tabletop card game using Unity and Mirror. In all of the previous parts of this series, we've been looking at single-player functionality, building the basic architecture of our card game. You might recall that when we hit the play button, we're able to hit the draw cards button, and that will draw cards on our screen and space them out just like this. And we're able to drag these cards around the screen, try and drop them anywhere except for this green drop zone, and they'll be sent back to the starter area. But when we drop it over a drop zone, it collides behind the scenes with colliders in the drop zone, and then is parented right to the drop zone, just as we want it to do. So this is great if you're working on like a single player game that maybe you have some enemies that populate up here and you handle it that way. But if you want to do networking, you're going to have to use a third-party package. The reason for that is that Unity used to have a native multiplayer solution, which was called UNet. That was deprecated some time ago. And as far as I've seen, they haven't really replaced it with anything. There's no perfect use case or perfect replacement for your use case when you're dealing with multiplayer. There are several third-party solutions. I think a lot of them are pretty good. The one that I have the most experience with is called Mirror. Mirror is actually a fork of UNet, so if you have worked with UNet or if you're looking at some of the UNet documentation, you'll find that a lot of the things are very similar, because Mirror is what UNet could have been if UNet had continued, if Unity had continued to support UNet. So there are a few things where you might feel like they're not seamlessly integrated because it is not first-party software anymore, but it really does do the job, and I'll attempt to give you an overview of how you can make it work for yourself in your card game. If you don't have any networking experience, I will say that you might find the difficulty level or the learning curve ramping up pretty rapidly here with this video and the next few videos. So I'll try to make it as accessible as possible, and just remind you that I have another short video on multiplayer basics using Mirror and Unity that you might want to watch to get up to speed. And also the Mirror documentation is pretty good at spelling out their approach to networking. I highly recommend looking over the guides in that documentation in tandem with watching these videos, as I will be covering everything in great detail, yet there are some basic multiplayer concepts that may be helpful having the information come at you from different angles. So the documentation is great for that. Okay, so let's stop this, and what we're going to do is we're going to click on Asset Store, because that's the way that we used to be able to pick up packages. And we'll notice that in this tab, the Asset Store has moved. So that just means that when if you're using this version of Unity, which I'm using 2020.2.6F1, the personal edition, you may have to go online and log into your account and find Mirror there that way and attach it to your account. But in any case, it lets us know that we can open the Package Manager, which you can also find by going under Window Package Manager. And here I already have enabled Mirror as a package, which I did this before this new implementation of the Asset Store. So you may have to do just a little sleuthing to get this attached to your account by doing that through the website, so that it appears here. And then so I'm looking for, up here I see packages in project, and I don't see anything about UNet. So I want to see, click on this and go to My Assets, which recognizes the assets that I have associated with my account. And this was, like I said, from the Asset Store. Then I find Mirror here, and there's an update available. I've downloaded an older version. I'm going to update to version 32.1.4. So if you're watching this video and you're, I just need to update here. If you're watching this video and you're using a different version of Mirror and things look a little bit different, that might be why. I've had at least one thing break between updates, like what the previous version of our Zoom card script, which we're going to work with in a couple of episodes. Just doesn't work anymore because of some Unity or Mirror update. So just watch out for that. If you're using a different version of Unity or Mirror, you might have different things here. So I've updated it, and now I need to import it into my project. I'm just going to click on import here, and that just means that because Mirror isn't bundled with Unity as a first-party solution, I need to bring it into my project from where it lives on the asset store. I want to import everything here that comes up in this dialog box, and that will import it into my project. This could take a little bit of time. And in this particular video, we're just going to work on setting up our project with Mirror so that it works. We won't really do any implementation until we start it with the next video. The first thing that I'll say is that every scene that you're going to work with that utilizes Mirror is going to need what's called a network manager. When you import something like Mirror into your project, you'll find that it actually might add all different types of functionality that you might not be familiar with, like new components and new types of scripts and even example scripts. With Mirror, a great thing that they have done both in their documentation and also in this package that we're importing, they've provided examples of different projects that you could use from a basic multiplayer game lobby to a Pong example, like the game Pong or Tanks, I think that they have, that you can kind of like step through their code and their prefabs and all that stuff and see how they did some stuff in case some of your functionality is different from what I have here. After that's finished, I see that under my assets folder there is also now a Mirror folder, and let's just take a brief look at that to see what's in there. We have authenticators. There's a bunch of different folders for like our components, the editor itself, some examples. I don't spend a lot of time looking through these things except in the examples folder that I mentioned. Like if you wanted to implement a chat, you could bring up one of these scenes or look through the scripts and see how they've done that. And you pretty much could copy and paste a lot of this stuff and then change your UI so that it situates it looking very much like your own game. But I'll let you click through this stuff on your own. Just know that it's here for you. So the first thing that I'm going to do in my scene here to make it multiplayer capable is I'm going to add a network manager. And the first thing I'll just do is I'll create an empty game object in the scene, and I'll name it network manager. Then here under in the inspector, when I have the network manager selected, I'm going to click on add component, and I'm going to start typing network manager, and we'll see that new network manager, new components have been added to the general component list that I can add because of Mirror. I'll click on network manager, and it brings up all this stuff. Don't destroy and load, want it to run in background. Really, there's nothing we want to deal with here unless you need an offline scene, and we won't really be looking into that in our very basic video tutorial. The two things that I want to bring your attention to. One is this area that says player prefab, and it says none game object next to it, and also registered spawnable prefabs. In a previous video, when we talked about how to create objects on our screen, specifically our cards, we talked about instantiating them. That's the terminology that Unity uses when you want to create a game object in your scene. When Mirror acts as a server for us, and we'll talk about servers and clients in just a bit. When Mirror acts as a server for us, it uses a different terminology than instantiate. It uses the terminology spawn, meaning that when you create a component that's not just in one scene, it's actually on the network, Mirror will spawn that server, spawn that game object for you. And so pretty much every game that we have or client that we have, and like I mentioned, we'll talk about clients in a bit, that we're going to be leveraging in our project is going to have a player prefab, an object that we determine it represents the player for us in our scene. And we want to signify what that prefab is here in our network manager. And any object that we want to spawn across the network, for example, our cards, needs to be registered in this network manager under the registered spawnable prefabs list. We'll take a deeper look at this in the future. I just want to expose it to you right as we create the network manager so that you know what it's for. It basically is just going to figure out who the players are in our scene and what game objects it needs to have control over as a server. If you want to work with the transports or the port or any of this stuff, this is one place where you can do it. You can also do it through code, but we won't be dealing with that. That's for you to figure out with the mirror documentation if you need to do something very custom. Otherwise, this should meet or match your needs. And in addition, we're going to add to this network manager game object a component, which is a network manager heads-up display or HUD. What this does, and you most likely won't need this in a live game or a game that you've deployed. Now when I hit play, it creates a little network manager heads-up display which says host, and it may be difficult for you to see. In fact, let me just build this so that it will be a little bit, well, you know what I can do? I can say maximize on play here in the game scene. When I hit play, you'll see that it says in this corner, this heads-up display that we've enabled says host, server plus client, and then it gives you a little field to determine where, what port to access. We're just accessing the local host or server only. So now's a really good time for us to talk about the types of relationships we're going to have. That sounds kind of weird, but the types of server and client relationships we might have in our game. UNet and now, well, let's just call it Mirror. Mirror utilizes two basic models for hosting our games. One is called a host client relationship or a peer-to-peer relationship where you will have a version of the game and I'll have the version of the game, and we'll connect to each other individually without a server that lives in the cloud somewhere. And what that's going to require is for one of our games to operate both as a server and client. That's called a host. If my game is working as a host, that means it's going to be the server that does all the back-end stuff that allows us to do networking. But it also needs to be a client, which means that it's going to render all the stuff on the screen so that I can play the game as well as being the host or the server. And then your game is just going to be a client. You don't have any server stuff going on. You're just looking at the game and playing it as normal. So I would be a host, which would mean server plus client, or and you would be a client, or vice versa. That's how the peer-to-peer networking works. There's another way where the server is divorced from the clients. Where, let's say I have a literal machine, a server that I run connected to the internet in my house or like somewhere else, and it is just waiting and listening for clients for multiple different clients to try to access it over the internet. So that means that in this scenario, I would be running this as a server only, and every game that attempts to connect to it would be a client. So in our scenario, maybe I've created a server and I've uploaded it to Google Firebase or Amazon AWS or Microsoft Azure or some other place. And it's just sitting there running as a server. And then when I try to play the game, I would be a client and you also would be a client. So because of this very specific approach to the networking architecture, we're going to have to code and develop our game around whether or not a person that tries to play the game is operating as a host, meaning a server and a client, or just a client. We'll get into the weeds on that quite a bit in the future. Again, I just want to expose you to these basic ideas from the get-go. Okay, so I can stop playing. I'm going to not maximize on play. And so let's just do one more thing in this video before we return to all of this stuff in the future. And let's create a player manager prefab. That will be the player prefab that is being asked for here in the network manager. So I'll just create another empty game object, and I'll call it a player manager. And then I need to add a few things to this player manager, and we'll learn that having this player manager is going to be crucial to everything that we do. And there are some things we're going to do with our player manager that we'll actually do with many of our networkable game objects or game objects that we want to show up on the network. So the first thing I'm going to do here is attached to my player manager, I'm going to add a component, and I'm going to search for network identity. And this network identity is simply so that the game object can be used on the network. That's literally for every networkable game object, we need to have this network identity attached to it. You'll see a couple of different options here. Is it a server only game object? And that's not the case for this. And the visibility is we're just saying that it's default. We don't really want to deal with when does the object become visible or anything like that. The other thing we want to do here is look for a network transform. And this allows the game object to have a physical, well, I guess digital transform in our scene on the network. So if we need to manipulate the where it goes and how it behaves, which we do with this particular game object, we want to have a network transform attached to it. And we're going to click on Client Authority here, which if we hover over it with a tooltip, it says set to true if moves come from owner client, set to false if moves always come from server. This is particularly important with our game objects, and to be honest, I haven't messed too much with this from a player prefab perspective. Our player is going to be populated on the server or spawned on the server by the server, and we're really not going to do much with it except for use its code to govern when to deal cards and all of that other stuff. So, I mean, you could make a case that you don't even need the network transform, or the client doesn't need to have authority over it. But you know what? I haven't really delved into this this part of it too deeply to be able to say whether or not this is absolutely essential. So, you know what? I really wouldn't bother with it too deeply unless you find a use case scenario where it's like mucking up your game or otherwise. And then there are things with sync mode, whether it's observers or the owner, because of the nature of our game being this particular game being turn-based, and we're not using like manipulating sprites on screen that need to be refreshed every second or something like that. I'm not too worried about any of this stuff. If you're doing a motion sensitive 2D game or like a 3D game using 3D models that are moving all the time, you might have to dig way deep into this stuff, and it's just not been an issue for me so far, and perhaps it won't be for you, but maybe it might be. And then we'll drag this player manager to the prefab area to create a prefab out of it, and then we don't need it in our scene anymore, because now we'll find our network manager, which is in the scene, and we'll drag the player manager prefab that we just created to the field here on the network manager that says player prefab. So now the network manager knows which prefab is the player prefab, and we want it to auto create the player when it starts the game, and we're not really worried on the player spawn method or anything. I think if you have a different type of game, you might need to change it to round robin, but not for our game. Okay, so that's going to do it for this video. Before we go, let's just press play. And in this game, we'll call this a host, server and client, and we'll see that the game has started, and it just says server is active over here. Nothing else is going on. And it's also started a client on the back end for us, and we can play the game. But what I want to note specifically is you'll see in the left side here, it's created a clone of the player manager prefab. It created a game object in the scene. So that's how we know that it's working properly, that it knows where the player manager is, the network manager does, and it has spawned it on the network here. If for some reason we played the game and we hit client only, it's going to try and connect to the server and then time out because it doesn't find a server running. That's why we run it as a host. We'll be able to dive more into this in later videos. But for now, I think we have a pretty good understanding of the very, very basics of how we're going to set up our game using Mirror. And in the next episode, we'll continue on just where we left off here. So I hope this video has been helpful for you. If it has, please be sure to like it and subscribe to my channel for more. You can follow me on Twitter, and I'd love for you to check out my games and books. You can do so by following the link that I have shared in the description for this video, or just go to www.nightpathpub.com. We'll see you soon.